Hi, this is Erica Berardi. I'm the editor of ENR California and ENR Northwest. And today we have Erin McConahey with us. Erin is a principal at Arup's Los Angeles office and an Arup Fellow. Hi, Erin.
Hi there.
How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you.
I'm well. Thanks for joining us. I know that you hold a deep commitment to sustainable designs that address the whole life cycle of buildings. And I was hoping that we could talk today about decarbonization. It's such a huge topic, hard to know where to start. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the work that you do at Arup and how that fits in.
Yeah, so right now I'm a mechanical engineer by training. Right now, I also am leading our America's Decarbonization Climate Service Action Planning team, and I lead our global net zero carbon buildings working group. So we're really trying in the global team to move from, historic understandings of what good looks like in terms of material optimization or energy efficiency to what we're calling a whole life carbon approach, which is endorsed by the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, and the World Green Building Council, towards thinking of whole life carbon as being the carbon emitted from embodied carbon, which is the materials you use in construction, as well as the carbon emitted because of the energy that you use operationally to run your building. And so we're really trying to move folks from just looking at how efficient things are to the carbon impacts of their design decisions.
Okay, and how's that going so far? How's the reception or feedback that you're getting? Is it a big transition for the way that people and designers think, or?
I think it's a fast-moving field because people really haven't collected information about the carbon factors that are incorporated with materials. It's very hard right now to get what are known as EPDs or environmental product declarations from a number of manufacturers. And that serves as the core. If we don't know how much carbon is emitted in the extraction, production, transport, refinement, and installation of a piece of material, it's very hard to take responsibility to decarbonize those material selections because we're working a little bit in a vacuum right now. So there's industry practice in the supply chain that needs to change to be more transparent about those things. And then on the operational energy side, here in the United States in particular, the carbon intensity of electricity, say, is wildly different depending on which utility you get your service from, the politics of the state that you're in. In California, where I'm at, there is actually a mandate that all of the electrical utilities need to decarbonize to 100% renewables by 2045. So folks who are looking at decarbonizing at a building scale can rely on some predictable trajectory there so that if they choose to make their buildings all electric, in order to take advantage of that 100% renewable, no carbon electricity in the future, that makes sense. But if you're in a different state that hasn't made those kinds of commitments, you're a little bit, stuck either making your own electricity or going into the market and trying to find green power sources to procure.
Right. And that's actually one of my questions with the different federal and state initiatives. I think it must be confusing and even sometimes conflicting, depending on where you are and what you're trying to do. I was also reading that decarbonization is kind of one of the most challenging issues really in our fight against climate change because of the reasons that you say. Is there anything that you've seen, particularly in California, that has been a successful example of what we hope to do more of?
Well, I think the first thing is the policy signals, right? That if it starts at that state level, and we've had a climate action bill, for more than a decade here, that has really aligned the city level policies, and the utilities, the mandates on the utilities through the Public Utility Commission. That's really where the direction has come, and then the private sector, can move around that. And because of the kind of the reliability of those mandates, them being laws, can access financing. from the private markets through their investors in order to start making decarbonization roadmaps. We see that also in New York, where Local Law 97 has come out that even existing buildings need to have a path towards decarbonization. And then obviously Carbon Free Boston and the Massachusetts Decarbonization Roadmap. Those are also very clear policy signals from the government that the government is willing to set those mandates and invest in incentives to help to make it happen, to become and to provide for their citizens sort of the carbon-free built environment that they know is necessary to meet the Paris Agreement goals.
Okay, thank you. And again, as far as legislation or any other action, is there anything in the pipeline or coming down the works next year that you are looking forward to seeing or hoping for?
Well, I think that coming out of COP26, certainly the conversation around everybody's collective action and individual responsibility at that corporate level or the institutional level or the city level. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm coming out of that. And clearly with buildings being almost 40% of the global carbon emissions, buildings is a place to not only play because of the magnitude of the impact of any action, but it's also one of the easiest places to take action because, well, buildings are fixed. They're already connected to utilities. So if the utilities are able to decarbonize, whether through all renewable electric utilities or hydrogen replacements for natural gas, it's really quite, I think the most fruitful location to take action, because also all of the technologies are already available on the electrification side. Hydrogen and hydrogen equipment is growing in terms of testing of feasibility in the research stages. But I think definitely on electrification of natural gas heating, natural gas domestic water heating, and cooking, these are all really already available now. And we actually paired with the New Buildings Institute to look at the building electrification technology roadmap that was funded by some of the California utilities in conjunction with NBI itself, and really mapped out market availability, applicability to different occupancy types. And really, the technology is already there. So that is not the problem. It's basically will and mobilizing financing in order to support this.
Okay, so you've done some research. Is there any other current research that Arup is doing right now in this area?
Arup has ongoing research in support with our partners, basically. So recently, we've published reports with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in looking at net zero carbon. Where do we stand now? And we did a number of case studies for them in the European context, a number of case studies with them associated with really testing what are the carbon emissions from a variety of different building types. Arup itself has made the commitment at COP to do whole life carbon assessments for the majority of our buildings projects within the next year, so that we have better insight into the carbon emissions associated with the design recommendations that we make to clients. And so that we can, basically use that information to set our own changes to our design practices, our own research agenda in order to help see how we can really drive carbon out of the design practices and recommendations that we make.
Okay. And for you personally, what do you find most interesting, or what has surprised you the most in your recent work or research or in planning? Has anything surprised you that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I think that while the availability of the technologies are clearly universal, where they actually pay back for themselves is entirely local, because it's heavily related to the relative, on the operational side, it's heavily related to the differential in cost of electricity versus gas for delivering essentially the same performance. And so, in certain locations, it's still not going to be return on investment beneficial to decarbonize. And so I think that's something that really we need to look at from a policy level to overcome. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece that we're always concerned about here at Arup is the question of equity. And, some of the studies that have arisen. So I led an exercise last year to look at in Los Angeles, just looking at our two largest occupancy types, commercial office building and then multifamily housing. And coming out of that sort of decarbonization study, some of our partners here in the office took that and is working with NRDC to look at affordable housing specifically with a lens of how do we ensure that people who are already struggling on that edge of energy poverty in the move to decarbonization, knowing that electricity costs are relatively higher than natural gas costs to achieve the same heating at the moment. How can we make that transition without further increasing energy poverty, or as New York did with local law 97, just leaving affordable housing out of the equation for the decarbonization transition process, which is no good because then the cost accrued to those parties will get even higher because they're still stuck on a stranded asset of natural gas. So sort of systemic level of decarbonization really needs to be taken into account at a community level, that we bring all parties along so that the entire community can end up being carbon-free built environment, accruing the benefits to public health for the most vulnerable from improved air quality by reducing combustion that's happening within our cities. And so we have to look at the totality of the co-benefits of decarbonization that don't necessarily happen to those who are investing in the decarbonization, but happen because it's a community benefit.
Yeah, it's amazing that everything in California, all of our biggest issues are so intertwined, whether it's housing and energy and water, wildfires. I mean, it's amazing that level of connectedness.
Yeah, and actually one of the really interesting sort of findings that we found both in the affordable housing work we did with NRDC and the affordable housing work that we were doing with NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, is that when we go from heating only, which is what's required by code in those property types that have been typically furnaces connected to natural gas, and convert them to heat pump types of electric heating, you actually get cooling for free. So it helps to address some of the cooling equity issues that we've been having in recent heat waves to allow people to shelter in place because they have cooling available to them now because we upgraded their heating. So it helps with that resilience of sheltering in place. But then we have to be a little bit careful about that energy poverty issue because now they'll be paying electricity for an additional service coming from that cooling that is beneficial to their public health. So it's a little tricky when we look at that nexus also of resilience and decarbonization and try to solve it at a systemic level.
Interesting. That's very interesting about the sheltering in place, because it feels like in California, especially, everybody becomes a climate refugee at some point with the fires, and I'm sure elsewhere in the country too. So that does seem like an important part of the equation. So what else, is there anything else that Arup is doing right now that you see is specifically important to reducing carbon footprints in your projects?
Yeah, I think on the net zero building side, obviously looking at embodied carbon is very important. Some of my colleagues up in the Bay Area have actually led a sort of a collaborative research project with a number of the counties up there and manufacturers to look at producing a low carbon concrete code for the Bay Area. And Marin County has already adopted that code. And through that collaboration to test, what is possible to achieve by either reducing quantities of cementitious materials, looking at replacements, looking at curing time, combination of those things, but testing them with the actual industry partners to say, which of these solutions that help us decarbonize concrete, which is used everywhere, how do we decarbonize concrete while still meeting your performance goals for schedule and for cost effectiveness? And so it's that collaboration that really leads to our ability to reduce embodied carbon. And I think that needs to be translated to different cities where, there's different availability of materials that kind of swing the carbon intensity of concrete, but then also looking at steel, looking at MEP equipment, starting to look at some of our key finishes and building envelope materials, glass, for instance. We have a study going on with some glass manufacturers because they also want to be able to explain to their clients, what the carbon reduction benefits are of picking glass A over glass B, both from an embodied carbon as well as an operational carbon point of view because of the performance that you can get out of that glass configuration. So looking at the supply chain is really big right now because as we get onto those 100% renewable electrical grids, embodied carbon is going to be the whole game. And we need to drive that down just as much in order to meet our Paris Agreement goals.
Got it. So when do we expect to see significant changes in this area or results that are, I wouldn't say tangible, but more measurable, I guess?
Well, I think, one of the key things that most of the sort of nonprofit NGO organizations, whether it be, Architecture 2030, the Carbon Leadership Forum, World Green Building Council, all are strongly encouraging and have systems in place to allow individual entities to disclose their current carbon emissions. We have current disclosures of energy use intensities as ordinances in a number of the larger cities. I would anticipate the trend would be that those would convert also to carbon emission disclosures, because really what the industry needs is it needs more information. And that's part of why Arup made its commitment to do the measurements, even if we don't have all the detailed level of information, but to do the approximate rough order of magnitude estimations of the carbon emitted from our designs so that we can test them and, share insights from the aggregation. Obviously confidentiality is preserved, but from the aggregated information that we get from that exercise with the industry to say what seems to be working at lowering carbon, both in existing building retrofits and in new buildings.
Any other trends that you see or anything else coming up in the next year that you're looking to?
No, I think, as more and more people commit to new net zero buildings, and we see, kind of how that plays with the current status of the energy codes, I think we'll see a lot of creativity and a lot of demands on the supply chain to come to the forefront with transparency. And I think that people will start to really look at, the viability of accessing renewable energy and demand on renewable energy will increase. Demand for legitimate carbon offsets will increase because almost all construction-based carbon emissions will have to be addressed through carbon offsets. And so how do we have carbon offset schemes that actually produce social usefulness? Right? How is it not that we just go plant trees that are going to get burnt down the next summer, right? How do we kind of reinvest in our communities to improve resilience, perhaps on our coastlines in more vulnerable areas, perhaps in other socially beneficial locations where we can have demonstrable reduction of carbon emissions as compared to business as usual, and to really start testing sort of those offset schemes to say how can they actually be beneficial as opposed to just a glorified accounting scheme.
Got it. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you think that ENR readers or listeners or viewers would actually like to know right now? Anything else? Any other insight?
I think that's the breadth with regards to decarbonization. I think it's a really exciting space, and I think that for those who wish to take climate action, the first place to start is at home, and literally at home, and in the buildings that we inhabit for 90% of our time. I mean, that's the place that's closest to us. That's the place where we can take the immediate action. And I think that's the place that people need to feel empowered to advocate with, their partners or their landlords in order to take what action they can as much as they can afford as quickly as possible.
That's an excellent point. So when we're done here, what should I do? What's the first thing I should do when we hang up?
Well, you know, the first part of every decarbonization exercise is understanding where the emissions are coming from, and that's from your energy use, right? Because you have sort of a fixed shell, your embodied carbon's already locked in there. So the question is, where's all your energy use going and how can you reduce that? So we always start with energy efficiency. Then we start with, well, where are you getting your power supply from? Can you go out and buy green power from the utility that you're attached to? If so, you know, it's going to probably be a little bit extra cost, but is it worth it in order to help us on our climate action goals? And then last but not least, you know, when the time comes and water heaters die or other equipment kind of comes to the end of its life, can there be a moment where you can consider electrification if your utility is already on a trajectory towards 100% renewables, or you've already committed to green power purchases for yourself? So I think that's really where things happen. For instance, like just a personal example. So in the last earthquake, the gas line, the natural gas line under my lawn broke. And once I understood the cost associated with getting it repaired, I said, you know, I could probably just electrify the whole house for maybe double that cost. And I said, it really would irk me to pay that much to repair it because I really believe in long-term electrification, and I'm already connected with solar panels on my roof and connected to green power purchases for the differential. So I'm just going to do it, you know, and it was a priority for me because I'm kind of a geek and I'm already working in this space. But it's certainly possible to do, even at a single family residence at any time now and going forward into the future. You know, the technology is there. You know, it's a little bit costly, but I had to be replacing things anyways.
Thank you. You've inspired me. Well, Erin McConahey, thank you so much for speaking with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.